Hi, I'm Jackie Tantillo, and this is Should Have Listened to My Mother. Welcome back to another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother. We are so excited. We can't believe it. Should Have Listened to My Mother won a People's Choice Podcast Award, a 2024 People's Choice Podcast Award for Best Podcast in the Society and Culture category. We also picked up a nomination for Best Female-Hosted Podcast, as well as a nomination for Best Podcast in the Kids and Family category. And that's just the cat's meow. And it's all because of you. Thank you for voting. Thank you for supporting me. Thank you for all the wonderful reviews on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for all your subscriptions on YouTube and your likes. We couldn't have done this without your support. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. And, you know, there are so many reasons why I love doing the show, in particular that I get feedback from listeners saying that they view the relationship with their mother differently since listening to these conversations. Having a different perspective can be eye-opening, and one can sometimes reevaluate a relationship and maybe even save it by expressing hidden truths before it's too late. I'm fortunate to host this series of conversations that reverberate around the world. The bond between mother and child can be complicated under normal circumstances, let alone when tangled up in lies and untruths. It can stem from love or lack thereof, jealousy, or even looking for love in the wrong places for the wrong reasons. But having only 3 weeks to rekindle lost love between a mother and daughter after a lifetime is unfortunate, yet also a gift. My guest, Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers, is a licensed sex and gender feminist psychotherapist, best-selling author, researcher, and keynote speaker whose expertise spans sex therapy, spiritual intimacy, parenting, medicine, and social justice, and so much more. She credits her large Swedish extended family for why she ended up writing books on healing sexual shame and on raising children without sexual shame and with sexual and relational intelligence. My guest's mother, Leilani, was born in Illinois in 1938. Leilani was the oldest daughter of this immigrant family that I just mentioned. Beautiful yet very sensitive from a young age, Leilani was misunderstood and deemed difficult by some relatives. At 21, Leilani was married and had her first child, Tina, who's my guest. 7 years later, Carrie was born. What happened at this juncture in this story is complex. Luckily, they found 3 special weeks for Leilani and Tina to rekindle their love before it was too late. Dr. Tina, welcome to Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I'm just so glad to be here with you, and I am grateful for your podcast. I think it's enlightening and holds people in a really important way.
It's kind of like that main root, like the trunk of the tree.
Right.
I never want to minimize dads because dads are hugely important. Sure. But, you know, yes. Women have this reputation of being quite significant in one's life. So
absolutely.
You are a best-selling author, and I do want to mention your books. So how about we just mention those briefly so people get an idea of your incredible background. My goodness, you've been doing this quite a long time. Sex, God, and the Conservative Church. Shameless Parenting, Everything You Need to Raise Shame-Free, Confident Kids and Heal Your Shame, Too. A Practice Beyond Cultural Humility, How Clinicians Can Work More Effectively in a Diverse World. Now, were you just the editor on that, or you wrote that as well?
I wrote, I believe, 3, maybe 4 chapters in that book. So I was with a compilation of folks, yeah.
And then there's also Sex, Gender, and Christianity. Do you co-author?
I wrote a chapter in that book as well.
Now that everybody knows that you're legit, we're going to take a little look at Leilani and... Mm-hmm. Sounds magical, your family experience and how open and natural things were. Very different from an American perspective. And I know those crucial last couple of weeks were very important to you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So where should we begin?
Yeah, I'm 64. So where do you want to begin? What seems most
Well,
interesting
why don't
to
we?
you?
I would like to, my listeners, because I have a little bit more background, to get an idea of what your relationship with your mom was like, when you were younger and how it progressed and changed.
Yeah. So I was born very early in my parents' marriage, and they were young. My mom was 20 when she married, and I came along about 18 months later. My dad was 26, and they were both, deeply in love with each other. There was a lot of chemistry between them. They were both beautiful people and in a dynamic time in their life. And I came along quickly, and they were both excited about that. And so I think without knowing it, I was bathed in a whole lot of love and celebration. In my early years, I was the first grandchild into a robust Swedish immigrant family that many of them lived on the same property with each other. There was just a lot of celebration that I enjoyed, I believe, as a young child. My mom's little brother, youngest in her family, he was only 15 when I was born. He was kind of the golden child in some ways, I think, being a boy and not really having the awareness we did then that we do now about gender and what we value and don't, and not as much evaluation of that. But then I come along and I'm his first niece, and he's thrilled about that. He thinks that's wonderful. And by the time I'm 4 and he's a senior in high school, I'm the mascot for his football team and the cheerleader out there. So it was just a lot of celebration. My family, my dad loved the outdoors, and there was fishing and camping, and my mom loved doing all of the things that kind of created family. And I think in many ways for my mom, and her marriage was something that she could sink her life and her love into. And in some ways, I think, let go of some of the trauma and challenges that she had had in her growing up years. So in many ways, I think I came into the promised land in some ways as where they were in their relationship with each other, and just the hope that was instilled in me, just being born into this family at that time. And I think I was very delighted for those early years. And I continue to be so incredibly grateful for being given such a good start. My mom would laugh at, "You were so fat and happy," and she just loved all of that. And I think I just reaped the benefit of that. Challenge came,
yes,
for sure, as I turned like 2.
Yeah, it did,
and began to have a voice of my own. But prior to that, there was just, I think, a lot of delight, and I was fortunate to bathe in that.
They always say that babies present themselves at the right time for the most part. And it's hard to imagine that there was just one thing that made this transition happen in your home. Yeah. Your mom was unhappy.
Well, my mom became unhappy. Underneath it all, her foundation wasn't sturdy. And so as the marriage became a marriage, right, where, in my opinion, one of the beauties and challenges in marriage is that we eventually present to each other what the emotional work is we need to do from our own families of origin. And, and we begin to hold a mirror up to each other that says, "I don't really like this part of you. I don't really like this part of you." And we're invited to do something about that. And when that began to happen in my parents' marriage, and it would be around things like my dad would want to go hunting and my mom would feel abandoned, right? And then there would be a huge argument. And the trauma and abandonment from my mom's childhood began to rear its head, and she became frightened and violent when she was threatened like that way.
She didn't want to repeat what she had already experienced. She was getting fearful of the same thing repeating itself.
Exactly. And feeling, I think, left and, feeling abandoned, maybe feeling neglected. And I think she had been feeling those things in her own family of origin for a long time, and in the culture that she was raised in as a beautiful woman. I mean, she was a runway model by the time she was 13. But she would tell you that was all that was valued about her. So she learned to use that. And I think this sort of deep sense, am I valuable enough, would get activated when my dad's own wanting to do things separately would come to the fore, and it would erupt in very violent fights and violent language and that kind of thing. And it shows the degree to which my dad was determined to have some of his own experiences and wasn't going to have somebody control that. And he had his own traumas from growing up. And then my mom, and so things became frightening in my home as a young child. And I began the process of trying to figure out as a little person how to calm my parents.
What your role was. Were you going to save it, or are you the problem? Are you the reason they're so upset? And that gets that's rough.
For some kids, and I think that's where having the foundation that I didn't tend to go there.
Good.
I just tended to go to the place of, they need my help.
Yeah.
They need my help to calm down. And unbeknownst to me, they need my help to calm down because I need them to calm down, because I need the place to feel safe for me. But my overt, I think, thinking was, I need to calm them down so that they're okay and they can be happy and we can be fine.
Little children figure that out. Isn't it amazing? They figure it out, or they think it's their responsibility.
Yes.
The correlation between the loving Swedish family that I mentioned, the reason you got into your profession is the family that wasn't there for your mom.
Exactly.
So what happened? Where was the disconnect?
I think that it was a real combination of things. My mom was the firstborn. My grandfather had been married 5 years, had been here in the United States, I think less than a decade at that point. He was determined to make it, and to make it as an American. That was very important to him. And so worked really hard. My mom often said kids were to be seen and not heard. My grandmother was the 9th of 10 kids. And so she was more accustomed to being taken care of than taking care of. This was, as you mentioned, this was 1938, long before we understood what children really needed. And my mom was a highly sensitive person. I think now we would probably diagnose her as a highly sensitive child. And so my imagination is that she cried, she tried to get care, and people did minimum care, like they gave her food and changed her and all of that. But probably she did not get the amount of holding that she needed, soothing that she needed, eye-to-eye contact, touch contact, and might have been in like her crib or in a playpen or whatever. And she tells the story, and it was echoed by others. I mean, nobody refuted this, that she was coined the neurotic child.
Yeah.
And I think she was just a highly sensitive child that was not well understood in the system at that point. And I really don't think girls were as valued in that home at the time. And people were busy just trying to survive and make it and
become American. Yeah.
Become American. Yeah.
Who wants to be called or known as neurotic?
No.
So that's kind of damaging in and of itself, right? And then she went in, she was beautiful, and she started modeling, which is like, oh my
Right.
gosh. Woo. So there's a lot of emotional imbalance there too. Like they love me one minute because I'm
Right.
beautiful, but do they love me for the wrong reasons? Or am I still the
Yeah.
neurotic child?
Right. All of those things. She said she never remembers anybody going to like a school function or a open house or a parent teacher conference, but she remembers them going to my uncle's. And she loved my uncle, desperately loved my uncle, and you know, still, you know, loves my uncle. Um, but the only thing that I think she felt was valued was her
The physical
beauty.
beauty.
Yeah. She was very Scandinavian looking, you know, blonde hair, blue eyes, and striking. She looked like Marilyn Monroe's sister. I mean, she was just strikingly beautiful. And she was a swimsuit runway model. And I always like to think of things contexted in history. It would have been like, you know, 1953, 4, you know, in those years. And we know that this was way the Me Too movement by many, many years, by many decades. And um, I I didn't even know enough to ask her what that was like until she was experiencing dementia. So, but I have no doubt that she learned to survive in that environment as well and had to deal with, I'm sure, many experiences that she did not ask
And
for.
she probably didn't even ask her family for help how to figure it out because she kind of was on her own.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe that she thought it was her fault if something happened, you know, if somebody treated her inappropriately, that she had somehow done something. Yeah. And we still have that idea in the culture, right?
As progressive as we think we are, we have a ways to go.
Yeah.
But isn't that
No.
shocking and unfortunate?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have a younger sister,
Yep.
and
Mm-hmm.
then there's followed by divorce, and
Right.
you were there to take care of your little sister. You took care
Yeah.
of your sister.
Yeah. When she was born, I was almost 7. And I had so been in this position of trying to keep everybody calm and keep everybody okay when there was big eruptions. You know, they would get into physical altercations together, um, and they could lose their temper, both of them. But especially my mom could lose her temper in a way that I could tell she wasn't in control of herself, and so it was felt very dangerous to me. And so by the time my sister came along, their relationship was volatile enough that I really felt like I needed to protect my sister from the environment that we were in. And so I took that very seriously. I have on my refrigerator a picture from when I was 7, or maybe right before I turned 7, and she was 2 weeks old. And I'm in this little kid rocking chair that somebody had given to us. And the look on my face, the look of adoration and
Oh,
love on my face, and this little baby infant in my arms, says it all for me about what I committed to when Carrie came along. Was really to try to protect her and make it so that she could have as much of a fun childhood as possible.
you took on the role of the fixer.
Yeah, I sure did.
That's a lot. That's a lot for adults, let alone
Hmm.
someone who's approaching 7 years old. There's a lot in between when things started to change and
Yeah.
your mom remarried. So maybe you could just give us a shorter synopsis of how the relationship between these two women in your life that you loved and adored really changed drastically.
Yeah. Um, so my parents divorced when I was 17. My sister was 10. They both immediately remarried. They had contacts with what became their next partners before they split. And so my mom married in June of that year. They separated in October. My mom married in June, and my dad married in August. My mom, again, this was a replay of her first experience where she wanted to just like, this is her magic story. things are going to be perfect now. And she was going to wrap a ribbon around my stepfather and my sister would call him dad, and that would be her family, and it would be good. And I was too old. I was 17, had a great relationship with my father, and continued to try to be my own person, and said, no, I can't do it that way. I'll do it a different way, and I'll be loving and respectful, but I have to do it my way. And that really began to change a whole lot of things. So my sister and my mom developed a very codependent, manipulative, coercive, violent relationship that continued and continues.
And you were ostracized.
I was ostracized
because you didn't go along with the plan.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yep, exactly. And of course, it was very painful, and throughout the years. But it gave me an opportunity to keep working on how do I want to be and need to be in light of these things, and so I just really dove into doing a lot of therapeutic work and trying to understand how this was the best my mom could do, given all the things, and I, worked really hard to just be more or less at peace with it all. And this is what happened. This is what trauma does to people's lives. And it's why we as a country ought to care about trauma.
When it initially starts to blossom and bloom, not necessarily waiting decades before you start to tackle it. I'm curious, though, did you step back and distance yourself, or were you doing your studies and your therapies, and if they reached out to you, you would go, or what kind of a balancing act did you do?
I just began, when I got married and I began having children, I began putting up what felt to me to be appropriate boundaries. And school really taught me how to do that in a non-reactive way. So I'd say, I know that you want this, but I need to do this. And can we talk about it, kind of a thing. There was a sign hanging on our wall when I was a little girl. It was a poem called Children Learn What They Live by Dorothy Nolte, I believe is her name. And I remember studying this poem saying, this is how I believe children should be treated. And so I think I defended myself in those ways. I drew boundaries as I got older. And so, there was much more distance because I wouldn't have the enmeshed, volatile relationship with my mom, which was what she knew how to do. She knew how to do codependent relationships, but she didn't know how to do a mature one. So it didn't feel very good to her that I drew boundaries.
But it's controlling. But it was what I needed. She's trying to control. Right, she's trying to control.
Right, yeah. So she feels safer, right? But I'm not easily controlled. I'm a Taurus and I am a Swede, and I, had ideals for myself and for our family, and so it was a bit of a struggle. But I think it was hard for her because I wouldn't engage in the way that she needed me to, but my sister would, and I would say to my sister, you go have the relationship you want to have with mom, and you can do that kind of chaos and volatility. I can't. I won't. And but you do whatever works for you, and they continued a relationship and continue a relationship today.
There are 3 weeks that you were fortunate enough to reconnect with your mom.
So she was in a rehab center. She had some heart issues. And my stepfather was also at the rehab center for different issues. And they were in a room together, which was beautiful and so good for both of them. And so my sister and I alternated spending weeks with them while they were in the rehab center, while getting ready to move them into some more permanent kind of living situation where they could have more care. And so I came up and spent 3 different weeks with them. And my mom had growing dementia, which I knew, but I hadn't been able to spend extensive time like that with her. And what I realized is like the trauma center of her brain, her amygdala, had really turned kind of down low. And the loving, sensitive, sort of gentle human that was inside was very present. And so we just laughed and told stories, and I asked her about her life, and she could feel all of her love for me and how proud she was of me, and she no longer felt
Wow,
threatened by
that's
me. And it
fantastic.
was it was so delightful for both of us. And I had a childhood friend that lived really close that, had grown up with me and with my mom and all that. And so she would come to visit too, and we would tell stories of the Halloween costumes that the moms would make. And it was a beautiful time, and it was a time I was so grateful to see the heart of her.
Yeah.
Because it was a heart I got to touch at different points along the way, but I didn't get to have for any sustained period of time after probably the age of 2.
Wow. But it comes back.
Yeah.
It comes back pretty quickly, doesn't it? I mean,
It does.
if you have that experience to be able to, I'm so glad
Yeah.
her shift and her mental shift.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing how that happened?
Yeah. I was so grateful for her, and so grateful for the two of us, so grateful for me. But I also learned that she could be thrown back into a threat situation if she was told things that weren't true about somebody that she loved or whatever. She could be thrown back into a trauma state. And so I realized she really needed care that would work to try and keep her in a settled space, in a non-threatened space.
Was she compromised to the point where if you used trigger words or made her feel unsafe in any way, that her behavior would change, kind of revert back to some of her older behavioral patterns?
I didn't do that with her, but my sister, we would switch off. My sister came one time and just started launching into some things that were frightening to my mom and not true. Mm-hmm. And I just watched my mom because she trusts my sister, just change. And all of a sudden the hardness was there, the sense of, like vindictiveness was there, the anger it was all right there. Mm-hmm. And I just wept because I thought, oh, honey, you need as much peace as you can get as long as you're here. And she was vulnerable. She was vulnerable to being triggered. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, hopefully your sister doesn't do that anymore. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
There's no reason to go there, but it's complicated. And thank you for sharing this story, because I'm glad you had that opportunity to reconnect with her again. And it's amazing how giving our heart is, because all of a sudden, all that sadness and the trauma, whatever, it can wash away in minutes. Even
right.
Just hearing her
right.
voice or her recognizing you for who you are and how special you are.
Yeah, very sweet moments we had.
It's worth everything. So a little bit more about where people can find you. Again, Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers. You're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Let's see, Instagram, it's Dr. Tina Shameless. And Facebook, it's Tina S. Sellers. Also Twitter and LinkedIn, Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers. There's so much more of this conversation we could be having with you about your career and the influence of your wonderful Swedish family, which we could all learn from regardless of our age. So I thank you for joining me. And you made it a very special episode for Should Have Listened to My Mother.
Thank you so much for having me, Jackie. It was delightful to be with you.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Should Have Listened to My Mother.